ideas?
Yeah, my new mini dish.
Hey, kids, do you want to see a movie? What movie do you want to see?
What else? Anything else?
You don't have DirecTV. You bought a mini dish and it can't get DirecTV?
No one delivers more family movies, first-run films, more hits every half hour than DirecTV. If you don't have it, you're gonna get it.
Lock it.
DirecTV, satellite TV at its best.
You are witnessing, in its entirety, the Volkswagen sales pitch.
You want to take it for a spin?
During our national test drive event, you can lease a Jetta GL for just $169 a month on a 2-year no-hassle lease, which means for the next 2 years, all you have to do is put in the gas. On the road of life, there are passengers and there are drivers.
Wines this good must be guarded with care. That's why Franzia comes to you in an airtight pouch that protects the fresh taste to the very last glass. Maybe that's why it's America's best-selling wine.
Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri. Anyone who stood in their way was killed or kidnapped. All the while, they sent postcards back to their families in Dallas as if they were tourists exploring the countryside. Bonnie and Clyde shot 4 people dead in 1932 alone. They stole cars and guns whenever they needed them. While robbing a gas station, they kidnapped 16-year-old William Daniel Jones. WD, as he was known, soon became a member of the Barrow Gang. As he and Clyde were stealing a Ford V8, the owner of the car jumped on the running board. Clyde casually shot him in the head and killed him. The next week, their hideout was surrounded, and in escaping, they killed a deputy sheriff. Clyde's brother Buck was paroled in March 1933, thanks to the tearful pleas of his wife Blanche. Then she and Buck joined up with Bonnie, Clyde, and WD. The gang soon raided a federal armory in Springfield, Missouri, held up a loan company in Kansas City, and killed 2 more lawmen in a shootout. While police searched for them in vain, Bonnie and Clyde had slipped back to Dallas to visit their families. For all the attention they attracted as sweethearts on the rampage, the sums they stole were tiny. Their biggest heist was $2,500 in May 1933 from the First State Bank in Okabena, Minnesota. John Dillinger commented, "Couple of punks. They're giving bank robbing a bad name." The gang met a police ambush near Platte City, Iowa. They escaped narrowly, but Buck was shot in the head. On they went, but less than a week later, they were spotted at a campsite near Dexter, Iowa. The police surrounded the area, but Bonnie was up early. She saw them and roused the others. As shots rang out, she, Clyde, and WD managed to swim across a river where they hijacked a car. But Buck was hit in the back. When the lawman reached the couple, Blanche was bent over him, crying, "Daddy, don't die, don't die." As this photograph taken minutes later shows, they pulled her away. Buck hung on for 5 more days. Blanche was not allowed to see him. He died calling for her, but she was locked in a cell and was later sentenced to 10 years in prison. W.D. Jones had fled but was arrested in Houston. He claimed he had been forced to be part of the gang, but he still got a 15-year sentence. Over the next 4 months, Bonnie and Clyde killed 4 more lawmen as they continued to evade capture. Early one morning in January 1934, they crept up on a work gang at the Eastham prison farm in Texas and released 5 convicts. In the operation, a guard was killed. One of those set free was their old accomplice, Raymond Hamilton. Then came 2 murders which enraged the public more than any of the previous ones. This is a reenactment of the incident on Easter morning, 1934.
Bonnie and Clyde were boldly keeping a rendezvous with some of their henchmen near Grapevine, Texas. While they waited, they drank whiskey, made love to each other, and practiced their marksman by shooting at birds. Presently, 2 state highway patrol officers sighted the pair. They decide to investigate. They approach Bonnie and Clyde totally unaware of their identity.
The cold-blooded murder of the 2 policemen was witnessed by a farmer who was plowing a nearby field. The farmer recounted how a young, light-haired woman had calmly walked over to one of the dying officers, pumped another blast into his head, laughed, and jumped back into the car. After this incident, rewards were offered for the capture of the Barrow Gang.
This atrocious murder sealed the doom of Bonnie and Clyde. for every...
The two bandits had left a crucial piece of evidence behind them, an empty whiskey bottle.
They picked up the empty bottle, and shortly thereafter, the police department identified the fingerprints on the bottle as being those of Bonnie Parker, so they knew who they were after.
A few months earlier, the director of the Texas prison system, Colonel Lee Simmons, had hired a former Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer and gave him free rein to track down and capture Bonnie and Clyde by whatever means necessary. Hamer's project would be completed 102 days later.
Coming up, the outlaws keep on the move, but not for long. The Texas Ranger who brought them to justice. And later, Charles Starkweather. In 1958, he went on an 8-day murder spree with the 15-year-old accomplice Carol Ann Fugate. Their story is coming up.
Murder on the Run will continue on the History Channel.
Men's haberdashery, haute couture. The Lexus December to Remember sales event.
Now, through January 6th, Lexus is featuring exceptional values on its full line of cars.
Going down.
Uh-oh. Hurry to your Lexus dealer, where impressive values are in the bag.
When fix-it problems hit you from out of the blue, trust the folks in the red vest. They've got shelves full of products and loads of ideas to fix any fix you're in. Because Ace is a place for the helpful hardware folks.
Tomorrow night at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific, history's crimes and trials continue on History Alive. Then it's an all-new Civil War journal, followed by the powerful Firebird on automobiles and the headlines of 1951 on Year by Year.
It's coming up on the History Channel!
Now get 24 issues of the new New Yorker week after week for just $19.98. Save $40 off the cover price and get the special cartoon collection free with your paid subscription. Call 1-800-354-3400.
Hi, I'm Carrie Whitaker for Century 21 Home Improvements. Recently, I've been showing people how to create beautiful kitchens like this for substantially less than custom kitchen remodeling. It's called cabinet refacing, and it costs less because your kitchen's original framework is left intact. This free video explains everything. You'll see how Century 21 Home Improvements can completely transform your kitchen in just days. Why wait? Call for your free refacing video today.
Celebrate history with original, exciting documentary series. Break enemy lines on History Undercover. Relive the legend of the Civil War. Or take to the sea and the open road with the great ships and automobiles. And step beyond the threshold of man's true action adventures with more original programs. This is where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
The History Channel returns to Murder on the Run.
Frank Hamer, who led the team tracking down Bonnie and Clyde, had suffered 28 gunshot wounds in his long career as a Texas Ranger. For this assignment, the state of Texas was paying him $180 a month. Hamer's first job was to determine the whereabouts of Bonnie and Clyde. The source of that information was apparently one of their partners in crime, Henry Methvin. Methvin told Hamer that the couple used his father's house in western Louisiana as a hideout. Hamer also discovered that Clyde had established a makeshift post office near the house.
There was a large pine stump out on the edge of a field, and by this stump lay a piece of plank, a large piece of rough plank, And it was underneath that plank that messages would be left or received by Clyde and Bonnie.
But Bonnie and Clyde were still on the loose. Near Commerce, Oklahoma, 2 policemen flagged down a car with a bullet hole in its windshield. Constable Cal Campbell was hit and killed by machine gun fire as the officers approached the car. Police Chief Percy Boyd received a slight head wound and was taken hostage. Bonnie and Clyde held on to him for 24 hours, but liked him enough to let him go. Percy Boyd said that Clyde was cocky and vain. But he said Bonnie was more friendly, not at all like the harsh-looking woman in this picture. Bonnie had told her mother that she was annoyed by the headline, "Clyde Barrow's Cigar-Smoking Mall." The hostage reported that Bonnie looked more like the woman in this picture, and that she and Clyde seemed genuinely in love. In the car with them, she had a pet rabbit named Sunny Boy, which was intended as a present for her mother. With this clue, the tracking party headed south for Dallas, where the couple was meeting up with Clyde's parents and Bonnie's mother on a country road and browsing through recent snapshots. Mrs. Parker later remembered her daughter telling her quietly, "When they kill us, don't ever say anything ugly about Clyde." Bidding farewell to their folks, Bonnie and Clyde headed east toward their hideout in Louisiana, just the spot where Frank Hamer knew how to trap them. Hamer and his men came prepared for what would turn out to be the biggest ambush of their lives and one of the most famous in the annals of American crime fighting. This reconstruction was made just days later.
This untiring search finally brought the officers who were detailed to concentrate all of their efforts day and night to the apprehension of Bonnie and Clyde to a spot on a gravel road in the state of Louisiana.
On the evening of May 22nd, 1934, the 6 lawmen hid themselves in the heavy underbrush across the road from the makeshift mailbox where Hamer had reason to believe Bonnie and Clyde would stop to pick up messages, and they waited, along with the mosquitoes, through the night. Just after 9 the next morning, the lawmen heard a distant hum and then saw a tan Ford V8 approaching at high speed.
It looks like the car, fellas.
As the car came into view and began to slow down near the mailbox, Hamer was able to identify the infamous couple inside.
That's him for sure, I'll guarantee you. Get ready now.
Hamer said, "This is it, let's go." And he stood up, and the others stood up too. Hamer gave what I've always considered as the classic lawman's command: stick 'em up.
Riddled with bullets, the Ford stopped. This film of the death car is not a reconstruction. It was taken minutes after the shooting.
Here is Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, who died as they lived, by the gun.
Historian Roger Conger says that Bonnie and Clyde were ready as always for a shootout as soon as they saw the lawmen in the bushes.
She was sitting in there with a 20-gauge shotgun sawed off, lying across her lap. And she grabbed the shotgun with both hands, and it was short. The stock was cut off, the barrel was cut off, and she tried to throw it around into position to shoot at him, and he knew that there was no chance then of taking them alive. So he began to shoot his automatic Remington 30 caliber rifle.
Within hours of the ambush, reporters and onlookers swarmed to the site. Frank Hamer called his superiors back in Texas to say the job was done, and then called his wife to tell her he was still alive. The men who had hunted down Bonnie and Clyde became instant national heroes. The shattered Ford was towed into the town of Arcadia, Louisiana. A fence was needed because ghoulish souvenir hunters had already tried to rip parts off the car. One man had tried to amputate Clyde's trigger finger. Another tried to cut off his ear. Others had cut hair from Bonnie's head and material from her dress. Even children had swarmed around the vehicle and dipped their hands in the blood. On the back seat, the lawmen had found 3 light machine guns, 2 shotguns, a dozen pistols, and at least 1,000 rounds of ammunition. But for once, the couple never had a chance to get off a shot before the 6 lawmen had fired 107 rounds into the car in less than 2 minutes. Bonnie and Clyde had each taken about 50 bullets. There was chaos as the bodies were laid out for the undertaker in the back room of an Arcadia furniture store. There they were filmed to prove that they were really dead. That evening, an ambulance arrived and took the bodies back to Dallas, where they were cleaned up and put on display again for 40,000 sightseers. Among the sightseers in Dallas that day was Roger Conger.
There was Clyde Barrow laid out, new suit of clothes, well dressed, and they had done a commendable job of mending his features and his throat and where bullets had hit him. They had had to do a great deal of patching with mortuary clay and so on. But they had patched him up to where he was quite presentable. So I never thought much about that until as years passed, I realized what a celebrity experience that was to have viewed the remains of Bonnie and Clyde a couple of days after their demise.
Two items of special interest to the curious crowds were Clyde's jacket with its 40 bullet holes and his gun, which when examined closely was found to have 7 notches, one for each of the men that Clyde had claimed. Back in Dallas, 20 relatives and friends of Bonnie and Clyde stood trial for harboring the couple during their crime spree. The mothers of both outlaws were brought into court. Their lawyer pleaded that motherly love took precedence over the law. However, the judge was not impressed by this defense or by Mrs. Barrow's infirmity and gave them each 30 days. Clyde was buried next to his brother Buck in the West Dallas Cemetery. Afterwards, an airplane dropped a huge floral wreath. Despite her wish to be buried next to Clyde, Bonnie was taken to the city's Fish Trap Cemetery. While on the run, she had sent poems to various newspapers. They included her own prophetic epitaph. They don't think they're too tough or desperate. They know that the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together. They'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde.
Among the souvenir hunters were Bonnie and Clyde's closest relatives. Clyde Barrow's mother wrote to Frank Hamer asking for her son's weapons. "My boy was never tried in no court," she wrote, "and I do hope you'll be kindly enough to give me those guns." Hamer, of course, refused. The most valuable souvenir was Clyde's Ford V8, perforated with bullet holes. The car wound up in the hands of an entrepreneur who took it on tour, charging admission for a peek at history. In 1973, the car was auctioned off for $175,000. A quarter century after Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed, another couple went on a crime spree in the Midwest. The story of the teenage killers Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate is coming up when Murder on the Run continues here on the History Channel.
I'm so tired of waiting, tired of waiting for you.
Why wait for a cold pill to start working when there's Alka-Seltzer Plus cold medicine? Its burst of effervescence means its strong medicine is ready to rush relief the instant you take it. So what are you waiting for? Get fast relief. Get Alka-Seltzer Plus cold medicine. Also, rush soothing relief with Alka-Seltzer Plus hot flu and body ache formula.
Men's haberdashery. Haute couture. The Lexus December to Remember sales event.
Now, through January 6th, Lexus is featuring exceptional values on its full line of cars.
Going down.
Uh-oh. Hurry to your Lexus dealer, where impressive values are in the bag.
You're about to be sued by 26 people. Allstate defends over 50,000 people every year. Who's your insurance company? Being in good hands is the only place to be.
There was a time when wars were fought hand to hand and face to face.
I had experienced it.
But that's history. Today, the weapons have taken over.
Laser-guided bombs.
Track the evolution of firepower.
The X-31, the Super Cobra.
Technological revolution. From bows and arrows to guided missiles.
Oh, there's a hit.
Weapons at War. Tonight at 10 Eastern, 11 Pacific, only on the History Channel.
Hold it. This isn't you, it's an older guy.
Oh, that was before I got rid of my gray hair with Just for Men hair color.
Come on, that's too natural to be hair coloring.
Just for Men. Apply and in 5 minutes rinse. Gray is blended away for a totally natural look.
Think it'll work for me?
In 5 minutes.
Just for Men looks too natural to be hair coloring. And now try Just for Men Color Gel for the hard-to-color hair of mustaches and beards. Brush in, rinse out. Just 5 minutes.
His name, Alphonse Capone.
Whoa, wait a minute. Name is not Capone, it's Capone. Capone.
He's nasty. He's vicious. He's a gangster.
Wait a minute. Don't ever call me a gangster because I don't like that.
Well, how about Scarface?
The Scarface is strictly the movies. Everybody called Capone Snorky.
Movies in Time presents Rod Steiger as Al Capone. Friday at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
In 1958, Americans were horrified by the violent rampage of Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. They were at large just 8 days, but it was time enough to kill 10 people in Nebraska and Wyoming. Starkweather's guilt was never in doubt. He was convicted and executed. But Fugate maintained she was an innocent hostage. Like Bonnie and Clyde, Starkweather and Fugate inspired film producers and songwriters. In 1973, Hollywood dramatized their killing spree in the movie Badlands with Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen. And in 1982, Bruce Springsteen put the story to music in his song, Nebraska. Our program now looks at the couple who shocked and rattled the nation during the sedate Eisenhower years. You'll hear from a member of the prosecution team and from Carol Ann Fugate herself. Murder on the Run continues here on the History Channel.
The year is 1958. General Charles de Gaulle is greeted by cheering crowds in Algeria. A revolt of French settlers had brought him back as Premier of France. Stung by the Soviet success with Sputnik, American scientists raced to get their own satellite, Explorer, into space. Rock fans are distraught as Elvis Presley is drafted into the Army. In 1958, Belmont Avenue in Lincoln, Nebraska was an unpaved road of mostly shabby homes. By January 25th, no one had seen the family at 924 Belmont for several days. A note on the door read, "Stay away. Everybody is sick with the flu." When relatives came to the door, 14-year-old Carol Ann Fugate told them to go away. Concerned, the relatives called the police, who came and talked to Carol at the door. She told them everyone was ill, and they went away satisfied. But 2 days later, on the 27th, Carol's grandmother tried again. When Carol turned her away, she went to the police a second time. A group of officers and family members broke into the house. It was empty, except for 3 dead bodies. One was Carol's mother, Velda Bartlett. Another was her second husband, Marion, 20 years her senior. The third was their 2-year-old daughter, Betty Jean, stabbed and beaten to death. The police were told that Carol's boyfriend, Charles Starkweather, had called on the family a few days earlier. Starkweather was a known troublemaker, a 19-year-old who styled himself after the teen cult hero James Dean. His parents had 6 other children to cope with, and Charles ran wild. Among his exploits was racing stolen cars on this track. On January 21st, he had set off for Carol's home with a rifle, apparently planning to go hunting with the girl's stepfather. Now the police went into action, putting out an all-points bulletin to find Starkweather. They searched for Fugate's body, but did not find it. Then there was a sighting. Fugate and Starkweather were in the boy's car, headed south on Route 2, toward the town of Bennett. Had she been kidnapped? Was she an accomplice? Or was she a young girl doing as she was told by her boyfriend? They ended up in Bennett on the night of January 27th, at the farm of a friend of the Starkweather family, August Meyer. When they arrived, Starkweather shot Meyer and stole $100, another gun, and some clothes. By the time the police checked out the house, the couple was long gone. In the shed, they found 70-year-old Meyer. He had been shot in the head at close range. Local citizens formed a posse and joined in the manhunt, but Starkweather and Fugate had already headed back to Lincoln in a car stolen from a young couple out on a date. Before long, the car's owner and his girlfriend were found at an old storm cellar, riddled with bullets. 17-year-old Robert Jensen had been shot 6 times in the back of the head. He lay at the foot of the cellar steps. On top of him lay 16-year-old Carol King, also shot. She was stripped naked and had been sexually assaulted. Back in Lincoln, Starkweather and Fugate spent a night in their car and then looked for a hideout. They ended up at one of the town's biggest homes. It belonged to industrialist C. Lauer Ward. Starkweather took Ward's wife and maid hostage. When Ward came home from work, Starkweather shot and killed him. Clara Ward tried to call the police, but the killer stabbed her in the back. The maid, Lillian Finkel, was tied up and stabbed to death. The discovery of the 3 bodies caused a panic. Gun stores sold out instantly, and a $1,000 reward was offered. The local sheriff appealed for help.
Well, since discovering the last 3 bodies, which makes a total of 9 that we know of so far, Mayor Martin and I have made an appeal for all adjoining counties, including Omaha, to send all available help they can to Lincoln. It is our opinion that the car is still in this vicinity. We know he has been for the last 3 days, and we want to cover Lincoln block to block.
But Starkweather and Fugate, now driving the Ward family's Packard, were heading toward Wyoming. As they sped across the state line, the radio announced that the police were searching for the car they were driving. It was Merle Collison's bad luck to be taking a nap in his Buick as the couple drove along Highway 20. Starkweather fired a shot through his rear window. As Collison opened his door, he was killed by 9 more shots. But Starkweather had trouble releasing the brake. When a passing motorist stopped to help, the young killer threatened him, and the 2 men wrestled for the gun. By chance, a deputy sheriff pulled up. Starkweather jumped back in the Packard and roared off alone. With patrol cars on his tail, he sped through the city of Douglas at up to 120 miles an hour, leaving Carol Ann Fugate behind, begging the police to save her. Finally, bullets smashed through the Packard. Nicked by flying glass and believing himself shot, Starkweather pulled over and gave himself up. And so, after 10 slayings in 8 days, Charles Starkweather was at last in jail. Caught in Wyoming after an 8-day killing spree, Charles Starkweather admitted to killing most of the 10 people left dead in his wake, but he called the killings self-defense. He confessed to slaying the family of his girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. He said they'd accused him of getting her pregnant. A fight had begun, and Carol's stepfather had attacked him with a hammer. When Starkweather shot him, Carol's mother had come at him with a knife. Starkweather shot and then bludgeoned her with a rifle butt. Carol's 2-year-old sister was crying, and Starkweather silenced her with a hurled knife. Paul Douglas was a deputy county attorney at the time of the trials and a member of the prosecution team. He says Starkweather's claims of self-defense won the killer little sympathy.
He justified what he did on the issue of self-defense. That's what he claimed. And he was asked, how about the 2.5-year-old little girl? Yes, he said that was self-defense also. She was screaming out loud. She was making a lot of noise. She could have drawn attention.
Starkweather also admitted to an unrelated murder which had been baffling the local police, the killing of Robert Colvert, a gas station attendant 2 months before. Starkweather had killed one of his victims in Wyoming, but within 2 days of his capture there, he was extradited back to Nebraska, where 10 of the 11 victims died. High on a Wyoming cell wall, the killer wrote that Fugate had killed 2 of the women, but the girl denied it, protesting that she was his captive. Fugate claimed that she'd been tricked into helping Starkweather because he told her that her mother and stepfather were being held hostage. But the state of Nebraska believed that she was a willing partner in the crimes. It was decided to try both of them for first-degree murder. They elected to be tried separately. Starkweather's trial for the murder of 17-year-old Robert Jensen began in Lincoln on May 5th, 1958. He claimed, as usual, that he had acted in self-defense, but that seemed to be contradicted by the evidence. All of Jensen's bullet wounds were in the back of the head. The defense team called 3 psychiatrists, but none could define Starkweather as legally insane.
Under the rules of our court, I don't think that anyone could say that his killings were not premeditated. He understood the nature and quantity and quality of what he was doing, and he knew the consequences of what he was doing. I don't think anybody could have gotten him off on the insanity defense then or now, or since.
On May 23rd, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death. The state had encouraged Starkweather to give evidence against Carroll. At his own trial, he testified that when they hijacked Robert Jensen's car, it was Fugate who emptied the young man's wallet. And he said that she had jealously attacked Jensen's girlfriend, Carol King, because she thought Starkweather had had sex with King. Finally, Fugate shot and stabbed the girl while Starkweather was trying to get their car out of the mud. At the Ward home, said Starkweather, Fugate had packed herself a suitcase of stolen clothes. She had then stabbed Clara Ward, sprinkling perfume to hide the smell of blood, and knifed the maid, Lillian Finkel. Fugate denied all of this, insisting that all she'd done was to warn Starkweather when Mr. Ward came home. He had then taken Ward to the cellar to shoot him, and Fugate said it was Starkweather who killed the women. She swore she hadn't touched them. But Starkweather insisted that when he left the maid, she was alive, and that he'd only stabbed Mrs. Ward once. Before the trial, Fugate's attorneys decided to play up their client's youth, and they arranged an interview with a local television reporter. But by the time of the interview, her hair had been cropped short. She was dressed not in blue jeans, but in a sweater and long skirt, which made her appear 10 years older. Her manner was sharp and hard.
Why do you think he would even implicate you in that if you didn't have anything at all to do with it? Why do you think he'd want to implicate you?
Well, by now, I'm sure he hates me for running away. He's trying to make it look like I'm just guilty and serious.
Fugate insisted that Starkweather had terrorized her into obeying.
Did you ever break down and cry and beg Charlie to let you go or anything like that?
Yes, I cried all the way.
And he just wouldn't let you out of the car at all?
In everyone's mind was the possible outcome of the trial.
Have you thought that if you were convicted, that you might go to prison or you might even go to the electric chair? Have you thought much about that?
Yes, I have, and I don't really believe that I have anything to worry about that case. The Lord knows that I'm innocent, and I know it. And the people who are involved in it knows it.
Among the viewers was the father of one of the victims, high school student Robert Jensen.
At that time, I thought she was the most defiant person I'd ever seen. I think just her attitude and things, I don't think that she would have stopped right then if she could have got away. I think she wasn't bothered. I didn't see any remorse or any such thing like that.
At a recent press conference, Fugate herself explained her behavior during her pre-trial television appearance.
When they asked me to do the interview, I had no idea that I was going to walk into a smoke-filled room, packed with people, and the attitude that I displayed, which some consider a wise-ass attitude, was the fact that I was barely hanging on a thread. My constant thought through this whole thing was, please, dear God, don't let me lose my mind.
Coming up, the trial and conviction of Carol Ann Fugate and the long prison term that apparently rehabilitated her. She still protests her innocence.
This has been a ball and chain around me.
Could she have been wrongfully convicted of murder in the perpetration of robbery?
I was not totally aware of what was going on.
Murder on the Run will continue on the History Channel.
Men's haberdashery, haute couture. The Lexus December to Remember sales event.
Now, through January 6th, Lexus is featuring exceptional values on its full line of cars.
Going down.
Hurry to your Lexus dealer, where impressive values are in the bag.
Hi, I'm Carrie Whitaker for Century 21 Home Improvements. Recently, I've been showing people how to create beautiful kitchens like this for substantially less than custom kitchen remodeling. It's called cabinet refacing, and it costs less because your kitchen's original framework is left intact. This free video explains everything. You'll see how Century 21 Home Improvements can completely transform your kitchen in just days. Why wait? Call for your free refacing video today.
When the Union was in trouble, they didn't look north, they didn't look east, they looked west.
We were the only Western soldiers in the entire army, and we would have died rather than have dishonored the West.
These were the men of the Iron Brigade. On Civil War Journal, tomorrow at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel. Tomorrow on History Alive, Moscow's massacres. On Friday, the Mafia at war. And next Monday, the face of Tutankhamun. These are true action adventures. Miles from nowhere and poles apart, explorers have battled endless stretches of ice to reach opposite ends of the Earth, conquering the North Pole, exploring the South Pole. On true action adventures. Next, only on the History Channel.
Oh, you beautiful dreamboat, you.
Shift into the past Thursday nights as the History Channel presents Automobiles.
I owe much to those who have pioneered and developed the automobile.
Travel down yesterday's back roads to the days when the streets had no names. Or to the times when we believed the bigger the better.
Why, it's as wide as a bowling alley in there.
Automobiles, tomorrow at 10 Eastern, 11 Pacific on the History Channel. The History Channel remembers.
This is for Texas and freedom.
The Alamo. It was here where freedom lived and heroes died. Alec Baldwin and Raul Julia.
We will go home with honor, or we will not go home.
In one of history's greatest standoffs.
Mexico, finally, for the Mexicans.
The Alamo. 13 Days to Glory. Saturday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel.
The History Channel returns to Murder on the Run.
Carol Ann Fugate's trial for being an accomplice to murder and robbery began on October 27, 1958. Later, she recalled her bewilderment.
During my whole trial, I was not totally aware of what was going on.
A string of witnesses testified that she had helped Charles Starkweather in the killings. The press was hostile toward her. Nor was the jury of 5 women and 7 men entirely neutral. One of them later recalled that 2 days before he was selected to the jury, he'd bet a friend $1 that Fugate would be sent to the electric chair.
One of them, I don't remember which one, whether it was the prosecutor or the defense, but one of them I said I thought she'd ought to sit in Charlie's lap and save the double expense.
Starkweather himself left death row to testify against her. I don't care if she lives or dies, he shrugged. He told the jury that Fugate had threatened to blow her mother's brains out, that she'd watched television as he cleaned up after murdering her family, and that she'd had many opportunities to get away if she'd wanted, that she'd held a shotgun on Carole King, and that she had taken Robert Jensen's money. In rebuttal, Fugate's attorney pleaded that the young girl was frightened, having seen firsthand the terrible things that happened to the people who defied Charles Starkweather. According to prosecutor Paul Douglas, there was plenty in Fugate's own statements to the police that implicated her in the murders.
She admitted that when the policeman came to the door for the very first time, that Charles Starkweather was asleep in the other room, and that she got up and went back and woke him up and said, "There's a policeman at the door." This is what she said in her statement. "There's a policeman at the door. What shall I do?" And he told her what to say, and then she got up and went to the door and told the policeman everything was all right and sent him away. Hardly a hostage situation.
The jury was out for 24 hours, while Carol waited with her surviving family, who supported her throughout her arrest and trial. She was found guilty of murder while in the perpetration of a robbery. In Nebraska, the jury also decides on the sentence. They chose life imprisonment. Fugate cried out, "No, I'd rather be executed." She was sent to the state reformatory in York, Nebraska. Because she was still only 15 years old, the law prohibited her from entering the general prison population. Fugate spent the first 8 months in virtual solitary confinement.
I used to just sit and just, look out and, cry and everything. And then this, I think when it really dawned on me that I knew I wasn't leaving, that it was going to be permanent, was the day that I was fingerprinted. And they fingerprint you, and then they take your what they call prison term mugshot. And I think after this, I really felt, that, this is it. I mean, you're not leaving.
Meanwhile, Starkweather was fighting for his life. In April 1959, he fired his attorney and represented himself at a clemency hearing. At the last minute, he was granted a 3-week reprieve. But Starkweather went to the electric chair on June 24th. At York Reformatory, Carol Ann Fugate found a harsh regime. No talking was allowed except at meals and recreation. Radios were banned. Inmates could have school lessons, but only for 45 minutes, 3 times a week. It took Fugate 10 years to finish high school. The reformatory's only teacher was Mrs. Iris Sidoris.
And some way or other, I just tried to instill into her a quieter voice, a nicer walk, and things that I thought would help her, because I had no idea that Carol would be with us as long as she was.
Inmates at York were awakened at 5:45 a.m. Their food was often inedible. Their clothes fit poorly and were rarely washed. In daylight hours, prisoners were not allowed on their beds. Even if they felt sick, they had to lie on the concrete floor until nightfall. Inmates were even forbidden to smile. But as the years passed and the young prisoner matured, attitudes toward the role of prisons were also changing. 8 years passed before she first left York. It was for a judicial review. Fugate was refused a new trial. By 1970, she was the longest-serving inhabitant, staff, or prisoner. Conditions were gradually relaxed. In 1971, the prison authorities began to prepare her for the possibility of eventual release. A new reform-minded administration at the prison now allowed trustees to visit the nearby town of York. Fugate became a regular at the bowling alley, but she was still denied a work release program because of her life sentence. She was allowed to work at a local church daycare center. At first, some mothers had reservations.
And then I heard the name Carol, and I was dumbfounded, because we lived here at the time that the things happened that she was put in there for. And I remember barring my door at that time, and I was scared to death because my children, older children, were young then.
But the confidence of the authorities seemed justified. She had always been a model prisoner, and a new prison warden, J.J. Exon, was optimistic about her rehabilitation.
I feel quite sure that sometime in the future, possibly the immediate future, we can put Carol Ann Fugate back into society, where we think that she will have an excellent opportunity to become a valuable working member of our Nebraska community.
But there was still a strong lobby in Nebraska which opposed her release, however much she might express remorse at what happened.
I really wish that there was something I could do. I wish it was a magic word I could say, or a magic phrase, or something that would, that could bring these people back. I'm sorry. I'm deeply sorry it happened.
On June 20th, 1976, Carol Ann Fugate was finally released on parole. Now working as a nurse in East Lansing, Michigan, she continues to protest her innocence, and even took several lie detector tests after her release, which suggested that she was telling the truth. At a press conference in early 1993, she complained that her conviction had prevented her from having the kind of life she wanted, even after she was paroled in her early 30s.
I wanted to marry and have children and have a family. But when I seen as time went on, it was impossible. Because this has been a ball and chain around me. I could not subject a child of mine, as she said in Mommy Dearest, why did you adopt me? I never wanted to look at a child and have a child say to me, why did you have me?
Carol Ann Fugate called that press conference in 1993 after ABC broadcast a mini-series about the crime spree. She gave each reporter an envelope filled with information, including Starkweather's confession, and a letter from a psychologist who questioned her under hypnosis. She said it was proof of her innocence. But Carol Ann Fugate refused to answer any questions about the murders. 10 years earlier, in 1983, she did answer questions when she took a lie detector test on television. Fugate maintained her innocence, but the test operator said the result was inconclusive. For the History Channel, I'm Roger Mudd. Thanks for watching.
Next, we'll take you pole to pole on true action adventures. And be sure to join us tomorrow night as History's Crimes and Trials continues on History Alive at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific.
Coming up on the History Channel.
Coming up next, it's a race from pole to pole on true action adventures.
It's coming up on the History Channel. Hear ye, hear ye. Coming up on the
History Alive, brought to you in part by Chevrolet Trucks.
With the exclusive driver control system, a little security in an insecure world.
Daddy gets up. Ooh, pretty.
Now, no more of these are Daddy's corn pops.
Oh, look, Daddy's bowl is too full.
The problem with a cereal that tastes like popcorn, only sweeter, is that it disappears like popcorn, only faster.
Mommy, that's Daddy's.
We share.
Hi, girls.
Happy birthday!
Thanks, guys. Now let's all go make him breakfast.
Kellogg's Corn Pops. It's hard to stop when it's Pops.
Sonic technology is used to clean the most coveted diamond in the world. Oh, this. But Sonic technology is also used to clean something far more valuable. His teeth. The new Sonic Air Plus with sonic frequency brushing. It cleans like no ordinary toothbrush for strong, healthy teeth and gums. Sonic Air. Amazing, isn't it?
Modern Marvels.
Engineers came from around the country to be part of the biggest, most exciting construction project ever.
They were not only building a dam, they were building a better way of life. See how the first federal super agency tamed a raging river, bringing power and prosperity to one of the poorest regions of the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority on Modern Marvels, Sunday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel. Every second, every hour, every day, every time you watch us, the past will come alive only on the History Channel. Events that should never be repeated but always remembered. Tragedies that bear hope for a better future. Triumphs that strengthen generations to come. Through original documentaries, special movie presentations, and world premiere events, the History Channel will take you back. History's past burns bright, and the History Channel is committed to keeping that past alive. Welcome to our intriguing documentary series, History Sunday and History Alive, both hosted by veteran news anchor and journalist Roger Mudd. History Sunday and History Alive will take you beyond past horizons and bring you down roads old and new. Exciting, powerful, and moving are the History Channel's original documentaries, and they'll take you everywhere with a vengeance. The originals of the History Channel are the classics of the future, but we also remember the classics of the past.
I shall return.
In an age of great change comes a collection of shows that have their roots in the battlefield of war. These classic documentaries informed a world in transition. They are the History Classics. Witness the triumphs and observe the tragedies of the most recorded events of our time. With History Classics, you'll go beyond the story of the night with a classic look back at remembrances of yesteryear. Journalists and relatives of those who made history will comment on history's past and greatest events. It's all part of the History Channel's continuing mission to open up roads untraveled. Every second, every hour, every day, we'll never forget. So you'll never forget. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Now, the way to save money is less people doing more work.
Time to walk out to Office Max. It's easy to cut expenses there. Office Max has over 7,000 office products, computers, electronics, software, furniture, at guaranteed low prices. Talk about bottom line. There's great stuff, like Deflecto wall files and Manco packing tape. You'll save so much, there'll be company cars, bonuses, and big perks for everyone. Hey, I was just kidding. Office Max, we go to the max for you.
Dear, I want to talk to you about our retirement.
Oh, I have so many plans.
We can't.
We can't what?
Retire. We can't retire. You might even think about taking a second job.
Kidding.
Remember how we used to talk about putting some money aside?
Yes.
Well, we never did.
How did that happen?
Who knows? Listen, you like to get outside, don't you? Cut the grass. Lots of yards in this neighborhood. I see income potential here.
Don't let this happen to you. Plan with Alliance today. You, your financial advisor, and Alliance Capital, one of the largest investment managers in the world.
A History Channel world premiere. They came from all over the world, their possessions few, their dreams unlimited, to their Isle of Hope, their Isle of Tears. Now hear their stories in their own words.
We were so happy.
It was like heaven. Everybody's yelling and crying.
It was the place where one journey ended and another began. Ellis Island premieres Sunday, January 19th on the History Channel.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home.
Please call. We'll send you a picture and story of a child you can save.
There are millions of people in the world, but it takes just one to shake it up. And suddenly we're drawn to speculate about assassinations, kidnappings, bank heists, mass murders, and celebrated criminal cases.
Sam Shepard was acquitted tonight.
I am not guilty.
Find fascinating stories behind history's crimes and trials on History Alive with Roger Mudd. All this week at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel.
Next on True Action Adventures. For centuries, man has been trying to reach the ends of the earth. The triumph and the tragedy, all in the name of adventure, as we trek north and south to the poles. North and South polar regions are the most inhospitable in the world, and to survive in them takes courage and determination. But unlike Antarctica, which is a landmass, the Arctic is a frozen sea. Early exploration of it was motivated by commerce, specifically the desire to find the famous Northwest Passage, which passes around the north of Canada and into the extreme northern Pacific. If a way through the ice could be found, many believed that it would significantly cut the sailing time between Europe and the wealth of the Orient. This quest was to concentrate explorers' minds from the later 16th century to the present. Their names live on today. Hudson Bay, discovered in 1610, named after Englishman Henry Hudson. Across the other side of the Arctic, Dutchman Willem Barents sailed into what is now the Barents Sea. And the Bering Strait, named after the Dane Vitus Bering, who first established that North America and Asia were not joined. Over the years, numerous expeditions were mounted to locate the Northwest Passage, one of which was headed by Sir John Franklin in the mid-1800s. But his two ships, Erebus and Terror, went missing, having been caught in the ice. Relief expeditions eventually found the graves of some of Franklin's men. And as late as 1984, the last resting place of 3 of them was excavated. Their bodies, remarkably preserved by the Arctic cold, were examined. It was established that they had been poisoned by the lead used to seal their canned food. After Franklin, the pace of Arctic exploration quickened, and men turned their eyes to the North Pole itself. First to try to reach it was American naval officer George Washington DeLong in 1879. His ship was crushed in the ice, and he and most of his party ultimately perished. Fridtjof Nansen, a young Norwegian who had in 1888 been the first to cross Greenland, took up the challenge. He believed that a route could be found by sea to the North Pole, and in 1893 he set out with 6 companions to prove the theory. Their ship, the Fram, had been specially designed to deal with the ice, but even so, progress was slow. Eventually, the party took to their sleds, but the weather grew steadily worse. By April 1895, Nansen had struggled to a point 250 miles from the pole, but was forced to turn back, having been beaten by the conditions. Swedish engineer Solomon André now tried to fly over the Arctic by balloon. This took off from Spitsbergen on the 11th of July, 1897, but vanished in the Arctic wastes. Over 30 years later, in 1930, a Norwegian expedition came across the remains of André and his 2 companions. Their balloon, pierced by ice shards, had come down on White Island, 300 miles from their start point. André and his crew, using a boat as shelter, had survived for 14 weeks.
The boat was seen jutting out from the snow, and nearby was found the body. Apparently, André and his companions had died from fatigue and exposure.
Dr. Ferdinand Cook, an American explorer, was the next to try for the pole, setting out in 1907. This spurred 52-year-old Admiral Robert E. Peary to undertake his 8th Arctic expedition. Peary set sail for the Arctic in his ship Roosevelt. Cutting her way through the ice, Roosevelt made for the nearest point of land to the North Pole. But this still left Peary with a 500-mile journey to his objective. Undeterred, he set off with his dog teams, and after some initial difficulties with the terrain, the party made good progress. Finally, on the 6th of April, 1909, Peary, with Matthew Hansen and 4 Eskimos, reached the North Pole. But when Peary broke the news of his feat to the American people, he was told that Cook had beaten him to it, having lodged his claim just 5 days earlier. A furious Peary declared his rival to be a fraud and a liar. Cook, though, had a more amiable disposition than Peary, and this influenced the Americans to side with him. In the end, though, the Royal Geographical Society of London, which mainly governed these matters, refused to ratify either man's claim. In the years immediately after the Cook and Peary expeditions, the emphasis of Arctic exploration was on proving that the region was not as inhospitable as it appeared. The Eskimos, of course, lived there quite happily and had done so for centuries. Vilhelmur Stephenson, a Canadian of Icelandic parentage, now set out to prove that other races could survive as well. During his exploration of the Canadian Arctic from 1914 to 1917, he demonstrated that it was possible to live on what fish and game he could catch. He also developed a technique of establishing camps on ice floes. For much of the time, Stephenson was accompanied by an Australian, Hubert Wilkins, soon to become famous as a polar aviator. During the 1920s, it was flying over the North Pole which captured the most attention. In 1924, preliminary exploratory flights were made by Briton George Binney and American Richard E. Byrd, who was to become a renowned polar explorer. Byrd's team paved the way for future air races to the pole. Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who had been the first man to reach the South Pole, now hatched an ambitious plan with American millionaire Lincoln Ellsworth. Amundsen had already undertaken Arctic expeditions. But he and Ellsworth were convinced that they could reach the North Pole by air. They took off in 2 airplanes, but damaged one, and it was 4 weeks before they were able to reach safety in the other. It was Byrd's turn the following year, 1926. Indeed, Byrd had a trouble-free flight in his Fokker trimotor with its ski runners. He returned to his base triumphant that he was the first man ever to stand at the North Pole. Although speculation has always existed surrounding his claims, recent discoveries have put serious doubt on whether he made it. A few days later, Amundsen, Ellsworth, and Italian General Umberto Nobile took off in the airship Norge, which Nobile had built himself. In 72 hours, the airship flew 3,000 miles across the Arctic, from Spitsbergen to Alaska. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was so impressed by this feat that in 1928 he gave financial backing for another airship, Italia, to fly over the North Pole itself. The Italia left Spitsbergen that May with Nobile as her captain. After carrying out an aerial survey, she made for the pole and arrived over it on the 24th of May. Nobile dropped a crucifix given to him by the Pope and turned for home, but disaster struck. Faced with severe headwinds and icing up, the airship became impossible to control. Italia crashed into an ice pack. Some of the crew, including Nobile, survived and managed to radio for help. Several nations dispatched ships and planes to locate and rescue Nobile and his men. One who was involved in the search was Amundsen, now aged 56, who was lent a French seaplane and crew. Tragically, it vanished somewhere over the Barents Sea. Eventually, the Russian icebreaker Krasin arrived at the camp and rescued the remainder of the ill-fated Italia's crew. The spotlight now turned to the Australian Hubert Wilkins, who had spent much of his time in the Canadian Arctic during World War I. In 1918, he had flown in combat and been twice decorated for bravery. Wilkins believed that if weather stations could be established in the polar regions, more accurate weather forecasting could be achieved. In 1926, Wilkins and fellow pilot Carl Eelson began operations from Fairbanks, Alaska, setting up a forward base at Point Barrow, 700 miles away. Their flights culminated in 1928 with one that took them from Point Barrow across the Arctic to Spitsbergen. This 2,000-mile flight finally confirmed that the Arctic contained just ice and no land. In 1931, Sir Hubert Wilkins, knighted in recognition for his exploits, returned to the Arctic with an old U.S. Navy submarine, which he hired for a nominal $5 per year. His plan was to sail under the Arctic ice cap. Nautilus, as Wilkins renamed his vessel, set out from Spitsbergen. Unfortunately, bad weather and the poor state of the sub forced him to return to port. Years later, his vision would inspire others. True action adventures will return in a moment.
People call you guys bunny spotters.
Bunny spotters. I think that it trivializes what we do. It's much larger than that.
To watch somebody see it for the first time.
Whoa! I feel very fortunate to be here because, you know, when we're all gone, I'm still going to be out there.
If your tools are looking a little more rusty than trusty, turn to the folks in the red vest, because they've got a wide variety, including Ace brand hand tools, built tough with a lifetime warranty. That's what makes Ace the place, with the helpful hardware folks.
The Wall Street Journal keeps you on the cutting edge with news and insights that can affect you personally and professionally. Subscribe now and have the Journal delivered to your home or office. And with your paid subscription, you'll also receive our free personal finance software to help you make smart decisions. Get 10 weeks of the Journal and the software for only $3.80 a week. Call now, 800-354-3400. That's 800-354-3400 for the Wall Street Journal.
The average funeral today now costs over $4,000, but the most Social Security will pay to your survivors, if they qualify, is only $255, leaving your loved ones to pay the balance. If you're age 50 to 80, you can protect your loved ones with Montgomery Ward Life's Mature Life Plan. It pays cash expenses at your family's time of need.
It's important to know my wife or kids won't be burdened if anything happens to me.
I didn't have to take a physical. I didn't even have to answer any health questions.
With the Mature Life Plan, you enroll by mail and you cannot be turned down for coverage.
I feel good knowing that we're protected by Montgomery Ward Life, a company we know we can trust.
Call now and get a free booklet explaining Social Security benefits and free information about the Mature Life Plan.
For free information, call 1-800-354-3400.
Now, back to True Action Adventures, here on the History Channel. The Arctic played its part during the Second World War, notably with the Allied supply convoys to the northern Russian ports of Archangel and Murmansk. Weather ships of both sides traversed Arctic waters, and the U.S. set up bases on Greenland. After 1945, the Arctic became one of the arenas of the Cold War. Both the U.S. and USSR set up chains of radar stations in the region and carried out military maneuvers. In 1958, another American submarine named Nautilus, but this time a modern nuclear-powered boat, succeeded where Sir Arthur Wilkins had failed and crossed the Arctic Sea under the North Pole. This gave the Cold War in the Arctic another dimension. When Sir Hubert Wilkins died the following year, another U.S. submarine, Skate, scattered his ashes at the North Pole. American businessman Ralph S. Plaisted rekindled the urge to reach the North Pole over the ice. He tried in 1967 with motor sleds, but was thwarted by the breakup of the ice and high winds. He set out again the following year, using snowmobiles. These remarkable vehicles were able to traverse the roughest ice.
You ought to see these guys ride these machines over water right over water. When wide as this room, and there's a solid piece of ice over there, and there's a solid piece of ice over here, and they hit it at 30 miles an hour and go right across with sleds and all. And I caught myself saying, there goes my people, I got to catch up because I'm their leader.
When the party returned home, they were greeted as heroes, the first men to reach the North Pole over the ice since Peary and Cook, 60 years before. But British explorer Wally Herbert embarked on an even more ambitious polar venture that same year, 1968. He planned nothing less than a crossing of the entire Arctic ice cap via the North Pole. Herbert and 3 companions set out from Point Barrow on the 21st of February, 1968, forsaking mechanical vehicles for the more traditional dog sleds. They had to be wary of the spring thaw, and the ice sometimes barely supported their sleds. After spending the summer in a camp to await the autumn freeze-up, they were on their way once more. Sometimes their progress was good. At others, the elements restricted them to just hundreds of yards per day. They faced one particular threat from other beings. This was the polar bear, which could be very fierce. They therefore sometimes had to shoot them, but their meat kept the dogs fed when rations were short. For resupply, Herbert's expedition relied on monthly drops by the Royal Canadian Air Force, which delivered 20 tons at a time. These were red letter days, even if the fresh stores significantly increased the load which the dogs and men had to haul. On the 7th of September 1968, the expedition suffered a serious setback. Alan Gill severely damaged his back while handling his sled in bitter conditions. At the time, the party was on a small ice floe, and it was vital that Gill was moved to somewhere safer. Gill was desperate to stay with the group, and Herbert supported this. But back in London, the organizers of the expedition insisted that Gill be evacuated. Herbert continued to resist, arguing that to try to evacuate Gill during the winter was fraught with danger. Indeed, a light aircraft tried to land but failed. London, however, thought that Herbert had lost his sense of reason. Alan Gill did recover within a few weeks, and after spending 5 months in a winter camp, the expedition pressed on towards the North Pole. They reached it on the 5th of April, 1969, 406 days after they had set out from Point Barrow. Herbert sent a radio message to Her Majesty the Queen, stating that the party was in good heart and confident of completing the first crossing of the Arctic Ocean. Now Herbert and his companions were on the last lap to Spitsbergen. On the 27th of May, they sighted their first land since leaving Point Barrow. This was Phipps Island, just north of Spitsbergen. 2 days later, they actually set foot on land. They had been a staggering 464 days on the ice. But it was to be another 12 days trek before they sighted the British Navy ship Endurance, which was to take them back to England. In May of 1978, Japanese Naomi Uemara achieved the first solo trek to the North Pole. Setting out from Ellesmere Island in northern Canada, his journey took a mere 55 days. The following year, there was an equally remarkable achievement when a Soviet 7-man team under Dmitry Shparov set out to ski to the pole. After traversing 900 miles of polar ice in 77 days, they reached their objective. Over the next few years, other epics were to follow. The British Transglobe expedition set out in 1979 to conquer both poles, first tackling the South Pole in snowmobiles. Sir Ranulph Fiennes and Dr. Charles Burton then hauled sleds to the North Pole. They too celebrated their success. The Transglobe expedition returned to London in August 1982, almost 3 years after they had set out. They were welcomed back by Prince Charles. But then in the late 1980s, Robert Swan went one better, being the first man to reach both poles on foot. His 3-man expedition arrived at the South Pole in January 1986. 3 years later, Swan also conquered the North Pole as part of an international expedition. But in spite of the celebrations, Dr. Robert Swan wanted to use his achievements to draw attention to the increasing effects of ecological damage to the polar regions and to the world as a whole.
Look at our story as a small example, there's lots of other ones, and say, well, those people came together, took on the elements, didn't give up, and won. What we've got to do as a world is do the same.
The Arctic expeditions of the past 30 years may have left few records to break. Yet explorers, adventurers, and scientists continue to visit the region, fascinated by its solitude and the ever-changing pattern of its globally unique, ice-bound ocean. Next up, the brutal conditions take their toll on the men who try to make Antarctica their own.
Just what does it take to get in shape and stay that way? If you think you need to go to a gym to lose weight, get in shape, and have a body like this, think again. This is Bowflex, a real workout at home that's so good, we guarantee results in 6 weeks or your money back. Think about it. You could get results like tighter abs, finer lines, a stronger chest, and more defined legs in only 6 weeks. It's not magic, it's Bowflex. All of the most effective exercises, plus a great aerobic rowing feature, ready for a quick workout whenever you are. Nothing could be easier. The results you want are only 6 weeks away. Don't think about it anymore. Take action. Call us and ask for a free video and brochure on the machine that works like an entire gym, but fits anywhere in your home.
Do you want to make more money? Of course, we all do. So find out how easy it is to train at home for a better career. At ICS, more than 10 million men and women have trained for job promotions and new careers without ever setting foot inside a classroom. And now at home in your spare time, you can get your career diploma or even your degree. Choose from any one of these courses. High school, TV, VCR repair, computer programming, electrician, animal care specialist, auto mechanics, PC repair, medical transcriptionist, legal assistant, medical office assistant, learning the personal computer, dental assistant, electronics, or get your degree. You can major in business management or accounting. So call the ICS toll-free number and we'll send you one of these exciting career packs absolutely free. Your career pack explains how easy it is to train at home through ICS to get a better job. Here are those courses again, so call today for free information.
Call now for free information with no obligation. 1-800-200-6400. That's 1-800-200-6400. Call now.
Tougher than TV's toughest cops. This is one super sleuth who can really spring into action.
Go Gadget!
No matter what place in history, he'll crack the case and the mystery. Travel the world from the Far East to the Old West and uncover the clues with a Gadget's eye view. Inspector Gadget's Field Trip. He'll take you everywhere. Sunday at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific on the History Channel.
Now, back to True Action Adventures, here on the History Channel. The white expanses of Antarctica are one of the most desolate regions on Earth. The subcontinent is a permanent ice cap where temperatures as low as minus 120 degrees Fahrenheit have been recorded. In the Middle Ages, men believed that a southern continent must exist, if only to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere. But Captain James Cook, the first person to visit Antarctica, did not do so until the 1770s, when he circumnavigated it. Indeed, not until 1894 did men of a Norwegian expedition actually set foot on the mainland. This led to 1901 being declared Antarctic Year, with 3 expeditions mounted. One of these was British and led by a naval officer, Robert Falcon Scott. Among others in the party was Ernest Shackleton, a merchant marine officer. The expedition spent the winter of 1902 locked in the ice on board their ship HMS Discovery. That November, Scott, Shackleton, and Dr. Edward Wilson set out from their base near Ross Island, intent on reaching the South Pole. Bad weather and difficult terrain forced them to abort when 370 miles short of their objective. In spite of failing to achieve their main aim, Scott and his men were greeted as heroes when Discovery finally arrived back in England. In 1908, Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Charcot led a further expedition which explored a number of islands surrounding the subcontinent. Charcot's men took numerous modern gadgets with them, including motorized sleds and electric lights for their huts on shore. Ernest Shackleton, determined to reach the South Pole, led another expedition that same year, 1908. His ship, the Nimrod, was a veteran of the Arctic, where she had been used to catch seals for some 40 years. Shackleton and 3 others set out for the pole at the beginning of November 1908. They soon passed the furthest point reached by Scott in 1902. But again, the weather defeated them when just 100 miles from their goal. However, Shackleton's expedition was by no means a failure. 3 members became the first men to reach the magnetic South Pole. Captain Scott was still burning to reach the South Pole himself. Accordingly, he organized another expedition. This left London in the Terra Nova in August 1910. When Scott reached Melbourne, Australia, he received a telegram from another polar explorer, Norwegian Roald Amundsen, and his telegram read, "Am going south." This meant that there was now to be a race to the pole. Scott set up his base camp, which still exists today, on the Ross Ice Shelf below Mount Erebus. As previous expeditions had done, Scott made extensive use of dog sleds. Like Shackleton, he also brought with him hardy Siberian ponies. Indeed, Scott preferred these to dogs, although they did not cope with the Antarctic conditions as well as the huskies did. But in spite of these aids, Scott determined that the final trek to the pole should be done on foot. Apart from believing that this was the proper thing to do, he also wanted to spare his animals unnecessary suffering. He hoped that this sail would reduce the strain on the men hauling the sled. Scott's first task was to establish a chain of food depots to ensure that he and the other men making the polar attempt would not have to haul too heavy a load. Early in 1911, Amundsen arrived in his ship, the Fram. He set up a base camp on the other side of the Ross Ice Shelf from Scott. His plan was to rely entirely on dogs, killing some in order to provide food. Amundsen and 4 men set out on the 19th of October, 1911. They reached the South Pole on the 16th of December. Scott's party found Amundsen's tent at the pole a month later after a journey in which one thing after another had gone wrong. Inside the tent, they found a message of commiseration from Amundsen. The disappointment of Scott and his companions was intense. Indeed, as they surveyed the silent whiteness all around them, Scott noted in his diary, "This is an awful place." There was, too, the knowledge that they faced a return journey of 800 miles. Soon after they set out, the weather worsened. At noon every day, they halted and put up their tent to provide shelter while they prepared a meal. They did the same every evening. But with the increasing wind, this became ever more of a struggle for men who were becoming ever more exhausted. Once the tent was up, it was crucial to get the circulation back into their numbed feet. A hot drink was also important, but their stocks of fuel began to run low as the weather slowed progress towards the nearest food depot. Scott was also forced to reduce the food ration. They were subsisting on ship's biscuits and a can of meat per day, as well as tea and sugar. hardly enough for men battling the extreme cold. Some members were also suffering severely from frostbite. Each night they crawled ever more exhausted into their sleeping bags, with Scott writing with increasing gloom in his diary. Eventually they reached the Beardmore Glacier, which they had to descend. Sometimes the weather relented, but it was still a desperate struggle. On they trudged, but with Petty Officer Evans now too weak to help haul the sled. Eventually he collapsed, fell into a coma, and died. They reached the first food depot at the foot of the glacier, but it held much less fuel than they expected, and even though they had more to eat, it was still not sufficient for their aching bodies. They still faced a 400-mile trek, and it was 250 miles to the next food. Captain Lawrence Oates now had severe frostbite. Rather than drag down the other 3 men, he staggered out of the tent and into a blizzard to his death. This left just Dr. Edward Wilson, Lieutenant Bowers, and Scott himself, all now very weak. On the 29th of March, 1912, after being trapped in their tent for 8 days by a blizzard, Scott made his last diary entry. "I do not think I can write any more. For God's sake, look after our people." Not until the following November did a search party find the tent with the bodies of all 3 inside. True Action Adventures will return in a moment.
I'm so glad you got rid of that cat. He really smelled up your house. In fact, I think he was getting between us. But now, I think our relationship's gonna get a lot closer.
Tidy cat with continuous odor control. If it's anything less, you'll know.
Extraordinary things take place in this ordinary town, like Otis, reaching for that air filter. Extraordinary because of arthritis pain and the powerful heating relief he gets from ultra-strength Bengay. Turn up the heat on arthritis.
Sonic technology is used to clean the most coveted diamond in the world. Flawless. But Sonic technology is also used to clean something far more valuable. His teeth. The new Sonic Air Plus with sonic frequency brushing. It cleans like no ordinary toothbrush for strong, healthy teeth and gums. Sonic Air. Amazing, isn't it?
Log on at www.historychannel.com. It's where the past comes alive. They came from every farm and factory to fight for the future of America. A war between states where citizens became soldiers, brother against brother. Their struggle began as rebels and Yanks and ended as Americans. Civil War Journal. Tomorrow at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
Every month, the compelling true stories of extraordinary people. From A&E comes Biography Magazine. In the January issue of Biography, Harrison Ford, Evita, and more. Order now and receive Art Garfunkel's Across America CD with your paid subscription. Enjoy an entire year for only $18. Call 1-800-831-1616 and order Biography Magazine, because every life has a story.
Now, back to True Action Adventures, here on the History Channel. In August 1914, 3 days after the outbreak of World War I, Ernest Shackleton left Britain bent on achieving the first overland crossing of Antarctica. Once more, he took dogs with him. The men had an undying faith in the man they called the Boss. His ship, the Endurance, reached Antarctica in time to experience one of the severest winters ever known. Soon she was stuck fast in the ice. Her crew had to chip and cut away ice several feet thick in order to free her. Gradually, they were able to create a sufficiently large expanse of water for the ship to get up enough momentum to slice through the ice ahead. The Endurance, now free once more, pressed on, but not for long. Soon the increasing thickness of the ice took a firm hold on her, and she became totally frozen in. Shackleton and his men had to accept the fact that there was nothing they could do except wait for summer. The local inhabitants watched their activities with interest, especially the frequent games of soccer, which helped to entertain the crew and keep them fit. But the ice had not yet finished with Endurance. Her hull was subjected to increasing pressure, which, if it continued, would ultimately be fatal, and Shackleton's concern over this grew daily. The crew tried to relieve some of the pressure. But soon Endurance took on an even greater tilt, and her decks began to break up. There was only one thing to do. The ship had to be evacuated. This included the ship's lifeboats and all her supplies. The evacuation was carried out just in time, for Endurance now began her death throes. The pressure ridges on the ice floe meant that the crew were trapped where they were. They therefore constructed a makeshift camp and settled down to await developments. Shackleton hoped that the floe would eventually drift to the edge of the ice pack. This finally happened, and on April 9th, 1916, they launched their boats. They sailed through the floes, camping on them each night. And 6 days later, they reached Elephant Island. Here Shackleton landed, but concerned over the declining mental and physical health of some of his men, he decided that he must get help. So on the 22nd of April, he and 5 others set sail in one of the boats bound for South Georgia Island, 800 miles away, where a whaling station was based. Remarkably, after 16 days at sea, they made it. Then they struggled across the crag-strewn island to the whaling station, where they commandeered a vessel and collected a volunteer crew of Norwegian sailors. But Shackleton now suffered a series of frustrations. It was not until August 30th, 1916, 4.5 months after leaving, that Shackleton was able to rescue his men. All 22 had survived the ordeal and had never doubted that the boss would return. When Shackleton and his men arrived in the South American port of Valparaiso, the Chileans greeted them as heroes. It had been an extraordinary story of courage and endurance. Shackleton's lectures on his expeditions captivated audiences back in England. In 1922, he again set out for Antarctica, but died of a heart attack and was buried on South Georgia, a fitting last resting place. True Action Adventures will return in a moment.
Hurry, girls, before Daddy gets up.
Ooh, pretty.
Now, no more of these are Daddy's corn pops.
Oh, look, Daddy's bowl is too full.
The problem with a cereal that tastes like popcorn, only sweeter, is that it disappears like popcorn, only faster.
Mommy, that's Daddy's.
We share.
Hi, girls. Happy birthday.
Thanks, guys. Now let's all go make him breakfast.
Kellogg's Corn Pops. It's hard to stop when it's Pops.
The Wall Street Journal keeps you on the cutting edge with news and insights that can affect you personally and professionally. Subscribe now and have the Journal delivered to your home or office. And with your paid subscription, you'll also receive our free personal finance software to help you make smart decisions. Get 10 weeks of the Journal and the software for only $3.80 a week. Call now, 800-354-3400. That's 800-354-3400 for the Wall Street Journal.
War is hell. Recruiters showed up and said, boys, the country needs you, and off they went.
The bodies were stacked like cordwood.
A History Channel original documentary series puts you behind the lines to learn, to understand, to witness what armed conflict is really all about. Weapons at War. Next on the History Channel.
The average funeral today now costs over $4,000, but the most Social Security will pay to your survivors, if they qualify, is only $255, leaving your loved ones to pay the balance. If you're age 50 to 80, you can protect your loved ones with Montgomery Ward Life's Mature Life Plan. It pays cash expenses at your family's time of need.
It's important to know my wife or kids won't be burdened if anything happens to me.
I didn't have to take a physical. I didn't even have to answer any health questions.
With the Mature Life Plan, you enroll by mail and you cannot be turned down for coverage.
I feel good knowing that we're protected by Montgomery Ward Life, a company we know we can trust.
Call now and get a free booklet explaining Social Security benefits and free information about the Mature Life Plan.
For free information, call 1-800-354-3400.
Now, back to True Action Adventures, here on the History Channel. During the 1920s, new methods were being used to reach the South Pole. One of the most significant was the airplane. In 1929, U.S. Naval Officer Richard E. Byrd was the first to fly over the South Pole. 3 years earlier, Byrd claimed to have flown over the North Pole, although much of this mission is surrounded by controversy.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back.
Byrd returned to Antarctica in 1934 and set up a solitary weather station 120 miles from his base camp, Little America. He had radio contact with the camp, but began to be affected by carbon monoxide poisoning from his stove. The base camp radio operators noticed that Byrd's messages became increasingly garbled and concluded that he was ill. A rescue party was sent out, but it took a month to reach the weather station, and it was another 2 months before Byrd was well enough to return to the base. Byrd, however, was undeterred by this experience and returned to the Antarctic again in 1939. This time he took with him a massive wheeled vehicle called the Snow Cruiser, but it was relatively useless in the harsh climate. During the 1930s, a number of expeditions mapped as yet unexplored parts of Antarctica. And while the Husky remained the primary means of transportation, American millionaire Lincoln Ellsworth, who had done much Arctic flying, mounted a mapping expedition in 1935 and brought his airplane with him. He and co-pilot Rollick Kenyon aimed to carry out the first trans-Antarctic flight. They planned to do it in easy stages, landing several times to survey terrain from the ground. Ellsworth succeeded in his mission and had a range of mountains named in his honor. In 1938, Ellsworth and Kenyon had to make a forced landing because of mechanical problems, and a massive search was mounted. They were found safe and well at a deserted base camp. Their now extensive knowledge of the region had stood them in good stead. After the Second World War, Antarctic exploration resumed, with one of the leading participants being the United States Navy. They introduced helicopters to the region. In 1957, Admiral George Dufek landed on the South Pole with other U.S. sailors. They were the first to visit it since Amundsen and Scott had set up a base camp there. At the same time, a British expedition under Dr. Vivian Fuchs had set out to make the first crossing of the subcontinent by land, using specially designed vehicles called snowcats. Thus, motor vehicles finally conquered Antarctica. As the expedition passed the South Pole, Admiral Dufek was there to greet its members, who included Mount Everest conqueror Sir Edmund Hillary. Aircraft enabled the first women to visit the South Pole. 6 Americans achieved this in November 1969. Thereafter, the South Pole was on the tourist map for those who wanted unusual holidays. British explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes, during his Trans-Globe expedition of the early 1980s, crossed Antarctica by snowmobile. He then marched to the North Pole on foot, but returned in 1992 to try and do the same across Antarctica, together with Dr. Mark Stroud. Although defeated by the Ross Ice Shelf, their 1,350 miles in 94 days was the longest polar sled journey completely self-supported. Meanwhile, during 1989 to 90, an international trans-Antarctica expedition undertook the longest sled journey ever made, 3,500 miles in 220 days. This, however, was supported by aircraft, with the dogs being flown out for a rest when they got tired. Nevertheless, the thrill of actually reaching the South Pole itself was just as great as it had ever been. But by the 1990s, Antarctica had assumed significance for another reason. Measurements of the ozone layer above the subcontinent revealed that it was thinning because of global pollution. This could seriously affect weather patterns and is constantly monitored. At the same time, there has been increasing concern over the ecology of the region. Efforts have been made to clear up the litter deposited by expeditions and the permanent base camps. Even more drastic was the international agreement made in the early 1990s that the huskies, who had for so long been part of the Antarctic scenery, should be banned to protect the local animal life from disease. But the challenge of a first solo crossing of Antarctica remained. 2 men, a Briton and a Norwegian, set out in November 1995 to conquer this goal. First to depart was Roger Mears, in what appeared to be a repeat of the Scott-Amundsen race to the pole in 1911. Mechanical problems with his sled forced Mears to give up his attempt after 6 weeks. Berg Ausland set out 3 days after his rival. He reached the South Pole on the 21st of December, but frostbite forced him also to give up 9 days later. Thus, this bleak, far-off region still presents challenges which have not yet been overcome. Antarctica is sure to witness many more adventures in the years to come.
Watch out for the deadly sub-hunters, next on Weapons at War. And later tonight, step back in time to 1939 on Year by Year at 11 Eastern, 12 Pacific.
Coming up on the History Channel. Coming up on the History Channel. Coming up on the History Channel.
Next on Weapons at War, in deadly silence they stalk an invisible prey. Prey so stealthy it may be stalking them. Sub-hunters, next.
Gather your families. It's coming up on the History Channel. Gather your families.
Orlando.
Every time you visit, everywhere you go, Orlando, something else. Come and say hello.
Always something different.
Always something fun. The vacation of a lifetime. A sight to see for everyone. Your smile's gonna show it. You'll never outgrow it. Orlando. Your smile's gonna show it. You'll never outgrow it. Orlando.
This is it. I hope this works.
They've been in captivity a long time.
Return to your senses in Florida.
The classic scenes, the greatest shots, and the most memorable moments ever captured on newsreels were probably fake. Don't miss the show that shows how we've staged our past. Real Truth. On History Sunday, this week at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
The Mantis tiller cultivator is changing the way Americans garden. The Mantis weighs just 20 pounds, so it's easy to carry and operate. Yet the unique patented tines and powerful two-cycle engine lets you cut through hard soils and dig down to 10 inches deep. Mantis is so easy to handle that weeding and cultivating, even in tight places, is a snap. And with the optional Mantis attachments, you can dig furrows, trim hedges, aerate and dethatch your lawn, cut professional-looking borders, and remove weeds from cracks. Mantis's superior performance and rugged dependability is backed by a 2-year warranty and a lifetime warranty on the tines against breakage. So you get years of trouble-free service. The Mantis tiller is on sale, so call now for your free no-obligation information pack with details on our 1-year money-back guarantee. Call 1-800-495-4051 24 hours a day. That's 1-800-495-4051.
Oh, you beautiful dreamboat, you.
Shift into the past Thursday nights as the History Channel presents Automobiles.
I owe much to those who have pioneered and developed the automobile.
Travel down yesterday's back roads to the days when the streets had no names. Or to the times when we believed the bigger the better.
Why, it's as wide as a bowling alley in there.
Automobiles, tomorrow at 10 Eastern, 11 Pacific on the History Channel.
Next on Weapons at War. Silently stalking to track down and destroy an enemy they never see. The toughest job in the Navy belongs to sub-hunters, armed to attack from every angle. From the first depth charges in World War I to the impact of guided torpedoes on German U-boats. From rockets to robots, trace the explosive menace of sub-hunters. Next on Weapons at War.
Initially, the only way sailors could detect an enemy submarine was to see it. By World War I, the best way, and most often the only way, to sink a sub was to explode a large can of TNT next to it. However, as submarines became a more formidable threat to the safety of sailors, ships, and supplies, military planners quickly scrambled to develop the special weapons and coordinated tactics of anti-submarine warfare. The tables were turned. The hunter now became the hunted. From its earliest days, the U.S. Navy has been armed for one purpose: to maintain freedom of the seas. For many people, this projection of power is symbolized by surface ships and supersonic aircraft. These systems are often in the limelight, capturing headlines and the public's imagination. Alongside them, though, is a team of quiet professionals with a job that may be less glamorous, but is growing more important every day. Their wartime mission is deadly serious: to hunt down, identify, and destroy a most elusive adversary, an enemy submarine. It has been said that of all the types of naval warfare, the anti-submarine battle most occupies the thinking of senior strategists, for no other weapon is as surprising and deadly as the submersible ship. Although the submarines are out of sight, they aren't completely out of reach. Carrier-based Vikings patrol thousands of miles per flight, searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. Ship-based Seahawks join them, listening for the telltale sounds of an intruder below. Long-range P-3 hunter killers are on a watch for hours at a time, while deep-diving attack submarines track their counterparts all over the world. In the Cold War years, anti-submarine warfare was no less difficult, but at least the enemy was clearly defined. Until recently, the Soviet Union was the threat. At one time, in the 1980s, the Russian Navy was accepting a new submarine every 4 weeks. Today, the old guard is gone, but the large number of submarines they built are still there.
Although the Russian Navy is now busily disposing of its old submarines, it's also trying to sell off a lot of its less old and newer boats to emerging nations. There is now the risk of third world nations, of another Saddam Hussein getting hold of a submarine and threatening merchant shipping in one part of the world or another.
With countries such as Cuba, Libya, North Korea building submarine forces, the threat they pose may be greater than an all-out war among superpowers.
When you consider the number of weapons in the third world, the fact that 42 other countries have submarines today, more countries, Iran, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, more countries are getting submarines. The underwater world is becoming more dangerous. And I question if the United States will have the resources to effectively confront countries in the underwater environment, let alone fight them.
The submarine wasn't always considered such a threat. At the turn of the century, the first underwater boats were almost toy-like compared to the ironclad dreadnoughts of the day. As an experimental boat, they were interesting, but few admirals considered them as serious weapons of war. The first U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Holland, carried torpedoes and a small cannon, but they were immobile, welded inside her bow. The Holland had to be turned precisely in the direction of its target to fire, and without a periscope, it rarely scored a hit in practice. Improved submarines followed, with longer hulls, diesel engines, and greater ranges. They began to show promise, but it took a world war to make most people take notice of them. As the Great War spread across Europe and into the Atlantic in 1914, the British and German navies defied convention and held back their large warships, preferring to blockade each other's harbors instead. By 1915, with large numbers of British mines off the coast, the German High Command turned to its small U-boat force to prosecute the war. With a mixture of bravery and ruthlessness, these submariners set out on the Atlantic in search of vessels bound for England.
When they spotted the smoke from a merchant ship, submarine would race at high speed until they could identify what kind of a target it was. When they got within sight of the target, they would figure out which direction the target was going, try to race ahead of the target on the surface to get an angle that, as the ship approached, they could fire their torpedoes at it.
Once in position, the U-boat would slip beneath the surface and sneak up on its target.
Using its periscope, it would then line up the torpedo shot, fire, depending upon the size of the target, the importance, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 torpedoes.
In the first 4 months of 1917, 2 million tons of cargo were lost. The submarine had arrived as a viable weapon of war. When the Americans resolved to enter the war in 1917, their expeditionary force was the largest army ever to leave U.S. shores and the first to fight in Europe. To pass through the submarine-infested waters, the Navy grouped large passenger ships and cargo vessels together with warships to sail in convoys. The first means of defense for these ships was suggested by the British, who discovered dazzle painting. By brushing red and black abstract designs on the vessel's sides, its profile was found to be less pronounced on the high seas and appeared to blend into the horizon. This patchwork of cubism also made it more difficult to determine the ship's speed and direction, and less than 1% of all dazzle-painted ships were lost at sea. Other anti-submarine measures, however, weren't quite as effective.
The standard anti-submarine system was to find a submarine submerged using its periscope, to row across to it, put a black bag over the periscope, and smash out the glass of the periscope with a hammer. That system remained a standard operational technique until 1917.
As flying boats came off the assembly line, they were seen as an attractive scouting vehicle to protect convoys near the coast.
And it wasn't really until 1917 that aircraft became a potent anti-submarine weapon. Not only were they fast and able to catch submarines on the surface, but because of their height, they were able to look down into the water and see shallow dive submarines and attack them with gunfire.
The airship was also coming into its own as a reliable scouting vehicle. It could stay aloft longer, carry more personnel, and it made an ideal bombing platform. During the war, the Royal Navy used more than 200 lighter-than-air blimps off the English coast to seek out and occasionally attack German submarines. But the best weapon to guard against the U-boats and ensure the safety of the convoys was the destroyer escort. The old four-pipers were rugged and dependable, even in the worst weather.
It was found that the destroyer, because of its high speed and relatively long endurance, was an ideal craft to counter the submarine. If it caught it on the surface, it had sufficient gunfire and torpedo power to sink it.
4-inch guns awaited the U-boats on the surface. The difficulty was finding them underwater.
Initially, the only way you could detect a submarine was to see it. But once they were underwater, you could hear the noise as the submarine went through the water, the flow noises, as they now called them. So passive hydrophones, just listening devices, were hung over the sides of ships to listen for submarines.
The hydrophones were simply underwater microphones. If their operators heard a U-boat close by, they would release smoke screens to buy more time. Then, after positioning themselves above the submarine, the destroyer men unleashed their most effective weapon, the depth charge. First introduced in 1916 by the British, the depth charges were packed with about 300 pounds of explosive TNT.
The depth charge looked like a trash can, and you would just roll it off the back of a ship as you passed over the submarine. And hopefully the explosion would destroy the submarine. Very soon they fitted hydrostatic fuses to these, which were devices that would explode the depth charge at a preset depth. When the depth charge explodes underwater near a submarine, not only is it the force of explosive that might damage the submarine, but the water itself that goes out from the explosion of the depth charge has tremendous force. And it's hoped that the explosive force will buckle plates on the submarine or break things that will cause a casualty that will force the submarine to the surface.
Once on top, the Germans were outgunned and outmanned. By the war's end, 178 of the Untersee boats were on the bottom. The convoy system of destroyer escorts proved to be a resounding success. Of the 16,000 ships that sailed in convoys, only 96 were sunk. A new type of warfare, anti-submarine warfare, was born.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
Want to get your feet wet on the internet? AT&T makes it easy to catch the wave. Every day, AT&T helps thousands of businesses, big and small, search for information, send email, and set up websites where they can do business with their customers. So whether you're a little kahuna or a big kahuna, grab your board and hop on. AT&T. It's going to be a great ride.
Now, the way to save money is less people doing more work.
Time to walk out to Office Max. It's easy to cut expenses there. Office Max has over 7,000 office products, computers, electronics, software, furniture, at guaranteed low prices. Talk about bottom line. There's great stuff, like Peachtree Software and Packard Bell Computers. You'll save so much, there'll be company cars, bonuses, and big perks for everyone. Hey, I was just kidding. Office Max, we go to the max for you.
Mom, Dad, you were always there for me when I was growing up. And I'd like to always be there for you, but I won't.
What's the problem?
Well, I just never got around to investing any money.
Oh, dear.
Hey, older people are getting more active all the time. To be honest, I think that's what's wrong with this country. It just doesn't realize how valuable you old folks are. Plenty of good jobs out there for hardworking people like yourselves. Now you two get out there and make me proud.
Don't let this happen to you. Plan with Alliance today. You, your financial advisor, and Alliance Capital, one of the largest investment managers in the world.
Hi, I'm Carrie Whitaker for Century 21 Home Improvements. Recently, I've been showing people how to create beautiful kitchens like this for substantially less than custom kitchen remodeling. It's called cabinet refacing, and it costs less because your kitchen's original framework is left intact. This free video explains everything. You'll see how Century 21 Home Improvements can completely transform your kitchen in just days. Why wait? Call for your free refacing video today.
We now return to Sub Hunters.
The destroyers that fought in the First World War found their toughest adversary at home. Peace through disarmament was the spirit which moved the Washington Arms Conference of 1922. As a result, over 200 U.S. destroyers were eventually mothballed, and the construction of new destroyers came to a standstill for nearly 12 years. The submarine, however, continued to evolve. Advances in torpedo designs, faster engines, and powerful deck guns made them more lethal than ever. The airplane was seen by many to have the most potential in an anti-submarine role. One of the first craft built specifically to track subs was the NC-4 flying boat. It captured the world's headlines in 1919 by flying from Rockaway, New York to Lisbon, Portugal. The NC-4 demonstrated aircraft could patrol an area the width of the Atlantic. Airplanes also made effective smokescreen dispensers, blocking the surface fleet out of a submarine's periscope. The Martin torpedo bomber could deliver torpedoes against surface ships, but to drop them on submarines, sufficient underwater guidance systems would have to be developed. Airships were also the subject of experimentation. When the USS Los Angeles took on an airplane in 1929, many predicted it would become the ultimate anti-submarine system. But airships required special handling and proved cumbersome when they were deployed with surface ships. Their inability to operate in foul weather convinced the Navy to look elsewhere. After the Japanese victory at Pearl Harbor and their successive conquests in the Philippines and neighboring islands, the U.S. Navy turned to its versatile Catalina PBY flying boat to combat Japanese submarines. The Catalinas were ideally suited for sub-hunting. Without the need for runways, they could be forward-based on remote islands in the South Pacific. Speed wasn't its best asset. With a crew of 10 and a full bomb load, it could fly barely more than 100 miles an hour.
It was like a truck. I mean, it was an airplane that you had to hoist around. You had to muscle it a little bit, but it could sure do an awful lot of things.
The crews aboard the Catalinas were among the first to use sonobuoys. These were floating buoys with a hydrophone on one end and a radio transmitter on the other. After dropping a number of sonobuoys in a grid-like pattern across the water, the crew in the air listened to their radio for the noise of Japanese submarines. Since sound travels up to 20 times farther in water than in the air, the hydrophone operators could accurately measure the sub's course and speed as it passed from one buoy to the next. If destroyers were in the area, the course was marked with flares, and the ships were guided in for the attack. The Catalinas also employed one of the first prototype magnetic anomaly detectors.
Now, this is simply a magnetometer attached to the tail end of an airplane. This magnetometer would detect anything metallic that had passed directly over. The idea was to fly these airplanes over the water. If you passed over a submerged submarine, it would give you an indication. And with this indication, then, we were able to track that submarine underneath the water and get effects on his movement, and then fly down that line of movement and attack the submarine even though you couldn't see it.
PBY Catalinas were also used in the Caribbean and Atlantic against a new generation of German submarines. Between 1939 and 1943, the Untersee boats wreaked havoc once again against convoys headed toward England. Even the mighty British battleship Barham was no match for 3 well-placed U-boat torpedoes. The German submariners had a new tactic they called the Wolf Pack. This time they operated in groups of 6 to 10 and concentrated their operations in the middle of the Atlantic, where it was difficult for shore-based aircraft to patrol for long periods.
They had an immediate and devastating effect on merchant shipping. During the Battle of the Atlantic, they were able to sink vast numbers of British and Allied merchant ships that were sailing alone, or that were stragglers from convoys. and this led to the development of air cover.
With most of the U.S. carriers tied up in the Pacific, a number of merchant vessels were fitted with flat tops to become small airplane launching pads. Designated escort carriers, they lacked the speed and size of conventional carriers. Although their decks had room for as few as 20 aircraft, their presence was felt immediately. The carriers also brought with them a new type of torpedo.
Until World War II, torpedoes were what are called straight runners. You fired them, launched them from an aircraft, they went in a straight line to the target. During World War II, the U.S. started using acoustic homing torpedoes. Torpedoes that when they entered the water began searching for the sounds generated by a submarine. The kill ratio of launching these weapons and a torpedo striking a submarine was very high, almost 100% when they were introduced.
Oil on the surface meant the U-boat had hit the bottom. Airborne radar systems were placed aboard long-range B-24 Liberators, allowing them to sneak up on surfaced subs.
These aircraft would take off with a crew of about 20 people and fly into the middle of the Atlantic, find the convoy they were allocated to protect, and they were equipped with depth charges and bombs, and a pack of 4 cannon under the fuselage with which to attack these submarines. At night, from about the middle of 1942, the B-24s used powerful searchlights called Lee lights, so they could sneak up on a U-boat, catch it on the surface, and attempt to sink it.
While air power was gaining the edge against the submarines, destroyers were also being modified with an array of top-secret sensors and weapons.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
It's important to me that my Medicare supplement policy pays hospital and skilled nursing home co-payments.
I want to choose my own doctors and my own hospital. My Medicare supplement policy has to give me that right.
There's no doubt about it. These folks have valid concerns. Hi, I'm Dennis James, and there's a Medicare supplement policy that covers all those concerns and more. If you're 65 or over, it's the Total Senior Care Insurance Policy from Physicians Mutual Insurance Company. Now, this policy guarantees you freedom of choice. You choose your own doctor. You choose your own hospital. It pays your entire Part A and Part B deductibles. It pays all your Medicare hospital and skilled nursing home co-payments. So for all the details, call this toll-free number and get your free information kit. There's no cost or obligation of any kind. You're merely calling for information, that's all. Call toll-free 1-800-353-5445. That's 1-800-353-5445.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
I have a dream.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
American Heritage Magazine, the diary of the American way of life. From her greatest dreams to her worst nightmares, our struggles and our triumphs, our heroes and our villains. And now you can get your risk-free trial issue of American Heritage without obligation. Subscribe for only $19.95, a savings of almost 50% off the newsstand price. If you're not satisfied at any time, we'll refund 100% of your money back. So call now and get your risk-free trial issue. You'll also receive these distinctive publications, Civil War Chronicles and World War II Chronicles, free with your paid subscription. American Heritage Magazine.
Call 1-800-354-3400. The History Channel remembers.
This is for Texas and freedom.
The Alamo. It was here where freedom lived and heroes died. Alec Baldwin and Raul Julia.
We will go home with honor, or we will not go home.
In one of history's greatest standoffs.
Mexico, finally, for the Mexicans!
The Alamo. 13 Days to Glory. Saturday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel.
We now return to Sub Hunters.
During the Second World War, the threat of submarine attack wasn't just confined to the open oceans. Merchant ships were equally vulnerable inside harbors, where submarines could slip in and attack them at will. Along the U.S. coast, airships and PT boats patrolled day and night. With a crew of 9, each PT boat carried 4 torpedoes and twin machine guns. Still, the battleground was underwater. For protection, strategically important harbors were lined with a series of steel cables.
The standard anti-submarine defense system was the net. Each harbor was netted with steel mesh nets to try and catch the submarines, prevent them from moving. They were then vulnerable and could be counterattacked. Anti-submarine nets were in use throughout the First World War, developed during the interwar period, and were used extensively in the Second World War.
Perhaps the most capable anti-submarine weapon of all was the venerable destroyer. Deployed alongside convoys crossing the Atlantic, they kept a constant vigil against the U-boats.
There were 2 major developments which enabled surface warships during the Second World War to detect submarines. The first was the advent of radar, a mast-top radio receiving equipment which could send out a signal and receive a bounce back from any object in the water, such as a surfaced submarine, and this was particularly useful at night. Also, development had been carried out by the British, to a certain extent by the French and the Americans, into an underwater detection system. Initially it was called ASDIC, but eventually it became known as sonar. It's an underwater radar system which sends out a sound pulse which detects an object in the water by the return bounce coming back, and measuring the time between it gives you an indication of range and direction.
The British tightened the noose even further with a shortwave radio detector that pinpointed the location of U-boats when they transmitted communications to their headquarters in France.
World War II was the beginnings of the electronic war. Radar, sonar, electronic intercept. Suddenly, sounds and visions created by sounds became very important.
Now try and get that noise firmly into your head, because one of these days, I'm sure, you're going to pick it up, and then you'll know just what it means.
With improved hydrophones, trained operators could recognize the U-boat's distinctive noise signature, compliments of its noisy power plant and spinning propeller.
As long as it's one destroyer, it is not serious. If there are 2 destroyers, and in the second part of the World War, there were always 2 or even 3 destroyers, then it's almost impossible for a submarine to survive. Because once destroyer stops, finds the direction with the sonar, another one from another angle does the same, and the 3rd destroyer runs and gets a signal from the other destroyer when to drop the depth charges. Because then they have not only the direction, but also the depth.
As detection improved, weapons also improved. Instead of rolling depth charges off the stern of the ship as you passed over it, we developed what were called K guns and Y guns, which could fire a depth charge a few dozen yards to either side of the ship. This meant as a ship passed over a submarine's location, instead of just rolling off a few depth charges, they could also shoot them out to the sides and have a whole pattern, which increased the probability of hitting the submarine. By mid-World War II, the U.S. and British navies began using what are called a head-firing anti-submarine weapons. These fired very small explosive charges. They were called hedgehogs or mousetraps. They would fire a pattern of 8 or 10 of these at an enemy submarine's believed location. When they entered the water, they would not explode until they hit a submarine. So if they missed the submarine, there was no explosion to interrupt your sonar.
A depth charge above you or even on the side of you makes a lot of noise, rocks the boat, maybe the lights go out. And it's very frightening, but it doesn't do any deadly harm. But as soon as a depth charge is close to you and explodes beneath you, Then it breaks the keel and the boat is gone. I don't believe that there are atheists on this earth. If somebody states he is an atheist, and if he's the most ardent communist, I take him on my submarine and expose him to a depth charge. You will see how fast he is on his knees and prays to his God.
Ship-launched acoustical homing torpedoes added to the U-boat's growing list of worries. Faster, smarter, and used in greater numbers, the anti-submarine forces proved too much for the U-boats. By war's end, more than 750 German submarines sank to the ocean floor.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
I have a dream.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
American Heritage Magazine, the diary of the American way of life. From her greatest dreams to her worst nightmares, our struggles and our triumphs, our heroes and our villains. And now you can get your risk-free trial issue of American Heritage without obligation. Subscribe for only $19.95, a savings of almost 50% off the newsstand price. If you're not satisfied at any time, we'll refund 100% of your money back. So call now and get your risk-free trial issue. You'll also receive these distinctive publications, Civil War Chronicles and World War II Chronicles, free with your paid subscription. American Heritage Magazine.
Call 1-800-354-3400.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
There are millions of people in the world, but it takes just one to shake it up. And suddenly we're drawn to speculate about assassinations, kidnappings, bank heists, mass murders, and celebrated criminal cases.
Sam Shepard was acquitted tonight.
I am not guilty.
Find fascinating stories behind history's crimes and trials on History Alive with Roger Mudd. All this week at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel. Modern Marvels.
Engineers came from around the country to be part of the biggest, most exciting construction project ever.
They were not only building a dam, they were building a better way of life. See how the first federal super agency tamed a raging river, bringing power and prosperity to one of the poorest regions of the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority on Modern Marvels, Sunday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel.
We now return to Sub Hunters.
After World War II, helicopters became practical and effective weapons of anti-submarine warfare. Helicopters could fly far ahead of the fleet, and with a variety of special sensors, they could detect submarines and immediately drop weapons on their elusive targets. Almost from the onset, the potential to deploy helicopters at sea was in the minds of designers and the Navy. They began testing the Sikorsky R-4 in 1943, but for 10 years, the helicopter's role was limited to reconnaissance and transport details. The Sikorsky S-58 Seabat was one of the first helicopters designed with sub-hunting in mind and was first flown off aircraft carriers in 1954.
Helicopters were very useful because they could fly out to the site of a very tentative detection, carrying sonar buoys or magnetic anomaly detection or some other device. The helicopter could hover over the water and lower an active sonar into the water to try to localize the submarine.
With the odds stacked against them, submarine engineers looked for ways to regain an advantage. By removing the outside guns and railings from the U.S. fleet boats, they got a quieter, faster submarine overnight. Smooth, tear-shaped hulls finally allowed the submarine to travel faster underwater than on the surface. The greatest breakthrough came in 1954 with nuclear-powered steam engines. Now the submarine could travel for months or even years at a time. But that luxury came with a price.
The one great disadvantage with a nuclear-powered submarine is its nuclear propulsion system is more noisy than the conventional diesel-electric submarine. When running on its electric batteries, a diesel submarine is almost noiseless, but there's always the noise of the water pump in a nuclear-powered submarine.
Like the Americans, the Soviets grasped the potential of atomic power. And in 1958, their first nuclear-powered submarines were put to sea. The Grumman S-2 Tracker was best suited to meet the Soviet threat. In the 1950s, aircraft carriers were dedicated solely to the purpose of anti-submarine warfare, and they depended on the Tracker for long-range fleet defense. With a new generation of sensitive sonobuoys, the Trackers surveyed a wider span of ocean than ever before. Its onboard radar could pick up targets as small as a periscope, and a retractable magnetic anomaly detector kept watch for any unusually large metal objects below. Once they made a detection, S-58 Seabats were dispatched to the region to isolate the sound with active sonar, classify it as friendly or hostile, and continue to track it. Most surface combat ships built after the Second World War had large sonar domes built into their bows. They also carried weapons designed to defeat the submarine from greater distances than ever before. The remote-controlled Dash for drone anti-submarine helicopter was designed to prolong the life of vintage World War II destroyers. Dash carried 2 homing torpedoes and could be guided as far as 70 miles away. Anti-submarine rockets called ASROCs were added to destroyers. The ASROC could throw an acoustic homing torpedo more than 6 miles. Along with improved homing torpedoes, Weapon Alpha was introduced to escort ships. It could launch a 500-pound rocket-propelled depth charge nearly 3,000 feet. But as always, the surface ship had to know where to fire.
One of the advantages that a submarine commander has is being able to move in the water. The water is not homogeneous. It has layers of different salinity and temperature. He can move between these layers and distort sound or even blanket sound completely. A submarine moving at, say, 120 feet below the water may be completely undetectable to a surface ship with a hull-mounted sonar. But if that ship has a variable depth sonar, which can go down to 120 feet, it can detect that submarine by listening to the noise of the motors or the crew. So the variable depth sonar was developed almost rather like the system of a dunking sonar from a helicopter. It's dropped from the back of a ship on a long cable and can be controlled from the ship to vary in depth.
Seafloor detectors were designed and placed in contested waterways. These giant hydrophones monitored submarine movements and relayed sounds to evaluation centers by underwater cable. As deep-diving nuclear-powered submarines began to enter the U.S. Navy fleet, they had a new mission: to seek out and destroy other submarines in their own environment.
The best weapon to attack another submarine with is a submarine. To do this, it used passive sonar systems which only listened to the noise generated by enemy submarines. It also could, in an emergency, use an active system which would send out a signal which would bounce back off the hull, but thereby it would give itself away.
During the Cold War, these cat-and-mouse operations were centered primarily in the North Pacific, North Atlantic, and beneath the polar ice caps.
The aim of the game was to find out what the Soviets were doing, how they were doing it, and even follow them back into their own harbors to gain intelligence.
In the 1960s, the primary submarine attack torpedo was the Mark 37. It used thin, high-strength metal wires that unspooled behind it to receive steering commands from the fire control men in the submarine. At a certain distance, the wire broke free, and the torpedo turned on its active sonar. Although the active sonar guidance gave the torpedo's position away, it was hoped to be so close to its target as not to matter. Overall, the Mark 37 had a range of 5 miles.
The nuclear-powered USS Kermit prepares to submerge for an underwater test firing of the Navy's newest and deadliest long-range submarine killer, Sub-Rock.
In 1965, the Navy went operational with Sub-Rock, an anti-submarine rocket with a revolutionary depth charge.
Sub-Rock, capable of being fired from conventional torpedo tubes, is the Navy's latest answer to the threat of missile-firing enemy submarines.
The depth charge separated from its rocket and re-entered the water up to 30 miles away. The Sub-Rock's guidance didn't need to be precise. Its warhead was a nuclear bomb and could obliterate any submarine within 3 to 5 miles.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
Just what does it take to get in shape and stay that way? If you think you need to go to a gym to lose weight, get in shape, and have a body like this, think again. This is Bowflex, a real workout at home that's so good, we guarantee results in 6 weeks or your money back. Think about it. You could get results like tighter abs, finer lines, a stronger chest, and more defined legs in only 6 weeks. It's not magic, it's Bowflex. All of the most effective exercises, plus a great aerobic rowing feature, ready for a quick workout whenever you are. Nothing could be easier. The results you want are only 6 weeks away. Don't think about it anymore. Take action. Call us and ask for a free video and brochure on the machine that works like an entire gym, but fits anywhere in your home.
America Online makes your life easier and more fun. You've got mail. You'll see. Just give it a try. Call this toll-free number now for everything you need to get started. Try America Online.
Now get 24 issues of the new New Yorker week after week for just $19.98. Save $40 off the cover price and get the special cartoon collection free with your paid subscription. Call 1-800-354-3400.
Extra, extra! Coming up on the History Channel, extra!
Tomorrow night at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific, history's crimes and trials continue on History Alive. Then it's an all-new Civil War journal, followed by the powerful Firebird on automobiles and the headlines of 1951 on Year by Year.
It's coming up on the History Channel, extra, extra!
With Montgomery Ward Life's Mature Life Plan, you can protect your loved ones from the worry, cost, and confusion over funeral details.
It's important to know my wife or kids won't be burdened if anything happens to me.
With the Mature Life Plan, you enroll by mail, no agent will call, and you cannot be turned down for coverage.
I feel good knowing that we're protected by Montgomery Ward Life, a company we know we can trust.
For free information, call now.
We now return to Sub Hunters.
Since it first flew in 1959, the Lockheed P-3 Orion has established itself as the world's premier submarine hunter-killer. Continually upgraded and improved, the Orions are still on active duty. As with most anti-submarine aircraft, sonobuoys are the key to the Orion's success. In flights that can last up to 16 hours, 10 crew members work together with fully automated computers to monitor and process the signals of up to 99 sonobuoys at a time. The buoy's depth and life expectancy are preset. After 1, 4, or 8 hours of monitoring and transmitting sounds, they take in water and sink. The noises are recorded inside the Orion and then matched with a library of sounds of suspected submarines in the area.
Anybody can be trained to go out and land and take off on an airplane, especially one as forgiving as a P-3. The difference is when you're out on station and you're only a few hundred feet above the water and you're traveling about 250 miles an hour, and you're bending that airplane around a very small area of that ocean, and you know somewhere down there, several hundred feet underneath the surface, there's a large metallic metal object that you're trying to search for.
The Orion has carried a variety of weapons over the years, from homing torpedoes to depth charges, and for surface attacks, the Rockeye cluster bomb. The Navy decommissioned its last anti-submarine carrier in 1974, and since then, the sea-based sub-hunters have flown with the rest of the battle group. The S-3A Viking is the Navy's latest aircraft for this role. It carries a crew of 4 and can remain on station as long as necessary with the help of in-flight refueling.
The S-3 Viking is a carrier-based fixed-wing ASW aircraft. Like its larger cousin, the P-3 Orion, it has radar, sonar buoys, and certain other detection devices, such as an ability to intercept communications from a submarine. Like a P-3, you want to guide it to the general area where you think there's a submarine contact. Once it locates the submarine, it can again use depth charges or homing torpedoes or rockets to attack.
The Sikorsky Sea King was the standard carrier-based sub-hunter after it first flew in 1966. But in the 1970s, the Navy looked to give smaller cruisers, frigates, and destroyers their own submarine fighting capability. The Cayman H-2 Sea Sprite was selected to carry a revolutionary system called LAMPS, which featured a digital communications link between the helicopter and the ship's Combat Information Center. Here, trained personnel could monitor all the H-2's sensors and with their mainframe computers helped process twice as many sonobuoys as before. Today, the H-2 is being replaced with the Sikorsky Seahawk.
The ship will initially pick up a contact maybe 100 miles from their own platform. They'll process the information, they'll decide whether or not it's a valid contact, and at that point we'll fly out and lay various sonar buoy patterns which allow us to either regain or maintain the contact that we already have off of the ship. And once we lay those patterns out, we can make a determination of what the contact's course and speed is, possibly his depth, and then we can lay a Mark 46 torpedo on our track.
The SH-60B is used on smaller combatants and deploys passive listening sonobuoys. The F model SH-60 uses active sonar and is flown off aircraft carriers.
Because the aircraft carrier operates with a large number of ships in a formation, they're putting a lot of noise into the water from the passage of the ships, from their propellers. It's very hard to use passive sonar in that environment because the noise from the ship's propellers and the ship's passage is destroying the environment, and they can't hear an enemy submarine. The helicopters aboard a carrier, in addition to carrying sonar buoys, themselves carry an active sonar. They can fly out a mile or so in front of the carrier force, drop their own sonar at the end of a cable into the water, and start pinging, looking for submarines that might be in the vicinity.
The Los Angeles-class attack submarine began service in 1976. Today, an improved version has a wartime mission to seek and destroy enemy submarines.
With a nuclear-powered submarine, our only limit for remaining underwater is the amount of food we have on board. We make our own oxygen, we make our own water, we carry all the supplies we need, and we can remain deployed for long periods of time and go forward and carry the battle forward. And the only thing we have to come back for then is food or if we were to run out of weapons.
The sonar room is the eyes and ears of the attack sub. Here, sonar bearings of submarine and ship contacts are presented visually on a display terminal. The sounds they hear are like fingerprints. No two classes of submarines sound the same.
Well, this particular ship and most of the submarines currently out right now, unlike what you see in movies, there's no need to go to periscope depth to attack a contact. We're fully capable of carrying out an attack on either a surface or a submerged contact without ever seeing them, just on sonar bearings. The way that works is just teamwork between the sonarman and the fire control technicians. We send them bearings, our estimate of range, and they do their best to solve for what they think range is. And between us, we come up with what we think the solution is, and it works.
U.S. Navy attack submarines carry the Mark 48 torpedo. Its warhead consists of 750 pounds of high explosives. Upon launching, wire guidance permits two-way closed communication between the submarine and the torpedo. With a reported range of almost 30 miles, it has active sonar and passive acoustical searching modes.
War, of course, is measure, weapon, and countermeasure, counter-weapon. We now have submarines that are coated with anechoic or sound-absorbing material, which reduce the effectiveness of the torpedo sonar and enemy submarine sonar.
The latest research involves satellites equipped with radar and optical sensors to track shallow submerged submarines. Ironically, this emerging science is necessary because of so-called old technology. Third world subs use silent diesel-electric power plants and are inherently quieter than the Russian nuclear subs.
There's no sign that the proliferation of submarines is decreasing. I think more nations will go for submarines. As more nations go for submarines, other nations will have to have anti-submarine warfare systems. The best anti-submarine warfare system is another submarine, but that doesn't mean to say that helicopters and surface ships won't be needed. There'll still be the development of long-range maritime patrol aircraft in the anti-submarine role, and I think what we'll see is more and more space-based systems. It might be a low priority today, but I don't think it will be in the next century.
Technological advances come to both the hunter and the hunted, and the fragile balance is still maintained. However, anti-submarine warfare is still an imprecise science. Some people believe that soon there will be a device that renders the ocean transparent. But until then, anti-submarine warfare remains a deadly game of chess. It requires not only the skillful movement of highly trained and specialized players, but plain common sense and good luck.
Now, from the History Channel, Weapons at War presents Brute Force, the Air Weapons Collection, for $44.95, plus shipping and handling. Call 1-800-708-1776. As the war in Europe intensifies, FDR pledges neutrality. It's 1939, next on Year by Year. And be sure to join us tomorrow night for an all-new Civil War Journal at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific.